Hey guys, what's up? So, what makes a really great fantasy story? Is it the dragons? Is it the knights? Is it the wizards? Is it hobbits, right? What makes a great fantasy story? And what I think is the answer to that is that one of the answers to that, well, I think what the answer is that basically one of the things that makes a story a great fantasy story is the main character of the story. And this is different depending on who you ask. There's so many different characters as the main hero of the story, and it's completely different. Like if you look at the Song of Ice and Fire, the Game of Thrones stories, you could see there's really no central character. There are a lot of different central characters, and the story kind of like revolves around them. There's like a lot of different, there's no like one person that you follow throughout the whole story. You follow a lot of different people, and their different stories have all different stories happening. And sometimes the central character is a strong character and successful character, and the other times they're sort of a weak character, or they're just not a hero. You know, they could be just a person, but not a hero. Like in the comic book The Inkle by Jodorowsky and Mobius, the main character, John the Fool, is basically not a strong character, but this kind of triangular object comes around, and it makes everyone into a super person. Like whoever looks at it, whoever holds it, becomes a super person. So that little kind of like triangular inkle gives them power, and now a regular character who had no power and was not really an interesting hero all of a sudden becomes powerful. And he's got this pet bird, and all of a sudden from that inkle, that it gave the bird power, and the bird became this intelligent, larger like bird who can talk and speak human languages and stuff like that. And so it gave it power. It gave the bird power. It gave him power. So it's an interesting thing where you've got on the one hand, you know, you've got the character who has no power, but then some kind of object, some kind of magical object or powerful object gives them power. And this is seen throughout fantasy. You know, King Arthur only became powerful after pulling Excalibur from the stone, and the sword gave him power. Elric of Melniboné, the Michael Moorcock books, was powerful because of his sword, and he had like rings, and he had like other magical elements and spells and stuff like that. He was also an emperor, and so wherever he had a lot of money with him wherever he went, so he can always like pay people and get by that way. You know, so that gave him power too. He had a lot of money. And so same with the Hobbit. In the Hobbit or the Lord of the Rings stories, you've got the Hobbit. You've got the little, you know, kind of like halfling Hobbit guy, and he doesn't really have any power. He doesn't want to go on a quest to save the world or anything like that. Gandalf has all the power. You know, Gandalf has power. The elves have power. Some of the tree spirits, a lot of the other, like the dwarves, they had power. They were strong characters. You know, they were like heroes. But thing is that he didn't have any power, so he had to get the ring. He needed the sword, and together with that, it gave him enough power to go against the evil that was ravaging the land. In Donaldson's story, you know, there was the White Gold Wielder story where Thomas Covenant, he really wasn't powerful at all except for his ring, which was made of white gold. And in the regular world that he lived in, it was just a ring. But in the other world that he always traveled to and found himself in, this white gold ring was an item that possessed the wild magic that he had to understand and use in order to go against the villain of the story, which was Lord Fowl, who was going to destroy the land and all the people that Thomas Covenant kind of was their friend, sort of like befriended. So you've got that. You've got the person on the one hand with no power, who basically finds these magical items. So one great way to write a fantasy story is about a magic item that somehow gives you power. If you look at the opposite of that, the heavy metal story, the heavy metal magazine story, in the heavy metal magazine story, they had the absolute opposite of that. They had the green orb, and what was interesting about the green orb, the Lochnar, right? This thing was, everybody wanted to possess it, but everyone that possessed it would get killed by it. And so really, really interesting about this one, it was a powerful item that it would give people power, but it would also kill people. Like whoever possessed it would get some kind of power from it, but the orb would end up killing them because it was just evil and it was just floating around everywhere. Now, that's not an original thing, even though it was sort of like it's an anti-item or an powerful item. It's not such an original idea. In the Elric stories, the Elric of Melniboné stories by Michael Moorcock, Elric had a sword. It was a rune blade, and it gave him tremendous amount of power. It would steal people's souls, or creatures, or monsters, or whatever it cut, it would steal their soul, the sword, and it would give Elric power just by holding the sword. It would just the power would go through the sword into Elric and make him powerful. However, Elric's sword, it killed his friends. It would just kill people on its own, and it also ended up killing Elric. And so it was one of those items that gave you power, but at the same time would destroy your life and kill you and stuff like that. Same thing happened with the Lord of the Rings. The ring gave people power, but it also corrupted them. It also made them messed them up. It wouldn't kill them, but it messed them up. Gollum was, if you're familiar with the character Gollum, who had the ring in the Hobbit. The ring was Gollum's, basically. Gollum was possessing the ring, and the ring, while it would give Gollum some kind of power, I'm not sure what exactly it would give him, but it also messed him up. He was once a hobbit, and it turned him into this creature that was just talking to himself and living in a cave, underground, so he wasn't he wasn't part of he was just eating whatever was there, and he wasn't part of the Hobbit society that all the regular hobbits were, but he had the ring, and the ring would mess him up, even though it was greatly powerful. So the hobbits, like Frodo, he needed the ring to defeat the evil of Sauron, but then he needed to get rid of the ring also because he knew the ring was evil. It would give you great power to defeat the enemy or the thing that was plaguing the land, but if you held on to it, it would also mess you up and corrupt you, and it would be all kinds of stuff. And I think that's kind of symbolic of what they say about power corrupts. Anyone who gets power becomes corrupted by it, which is interesting because, it's interesting because maybe if you look at it that way, you could look at politicians and not all politicians, but some politicians, and when they're running for office, they promise all of these great things to people, but once they get into office, they kind of don't really care anymore. They're already in office. They already got their power, so they don't care about doing all of these nice things that they really intended to do once they attain that kind of power. They're like, when I'm in office, I'm going to do this great stuff for people. But once they get into office and actually get the power, they no longer want to do those good things anymore. And that's why a lot of politicians don't do what they promised when they were running for office. It feels that that's that kind of paradigm where power corrupts. But basically you want to intend to use this ring of power for something good, but when you get this ring and it gives you that power, you become more selfish and just want it for the power rather than for the good that you intended in the first place. So I do feel like that's kind of the paradigm, because through history, it's just like human nature. People are saying, well, if I was in power, I would do these great things for everything in society and stuff like that. And then what happens when they go into power, they already got their power, so they don't really care anymore. they stop that good nature that they promised in the first place. And the only time they would actually like follow through with any of the promises is if they were to get reelected. They would just promise it, like it was like, I'll do these great things in return if you give me power, right? And that's kind of like what the powerful magic item in fantasy stories do. It's like, I will do this great thing. If I had the power to do it, I would do it. But once the power is attained, you're now corrupted by it, and you no longer have that goodwill. Now you just want more power, you know? And this is sort of like what was going on. Now in the King Arthur book, which was interesting because talking about politicians and kings and all that, you know, in the King Arthur book, it was just like, it was basically the sword Excalibur was in the stone because a lot of people wanted that power. A lot of people wanted to become king. You know, Merlin put it into the stone and said, anyone that pulls it will become king of the land, of like all of the land. And people tried pulling it, but they weren't like right for the sword. They weren't right for the role. People tried to pull it, and the only person that was able to pull it was the person that would actually, you know, get the sword, but actually do good things. That actually someone that would not be corrupted by it. So Arthur was able to pull the sword from the stone and actually become king, and then set up a round table and try to unify the land, or all the different factions of people that lived in the land. They try to unify it and make it like a united land, where his Knights of the Round Table were like the ambassadors, and they would make sure that everyone is benefiting and everyone's like doing good and stuff like that. So we had these very, very good-natured people, and that sword, it basically only let the person that was going to use it positively to actually use it at all. So where it was a good sword, and what was interesting about it was that it wouldn't just let anyone pull it. Only the right person who would actually unify the land and would actually like create like peace in the land and harmony. And I think at the time, there was some kind of level of peace at the time of this happening, because the stories that, you know, the tales are that Arthur was a real person. There was really an Excalibur, there was a Merlin, all of these things were real. We don't know if it's true or not, but the story says that these were really, and they actually found traces of people that were in the whole King Arthur stories, or they say there are traces of those people and whatever, you know. But that's an interesting concept, where the sword would only let the wielder who was good-willed enough to not get corrupted by the power to actually wield it. Otherwise, the sword did not want it to, would not let anyone wield it. Same like Thor's hammer, like no one but Thor could lift it. And that was the same idea. And of course, like Thor's hammer was the same idea, but Thor's hammer goes way back. I mean, it goes hundreds of years, or even, I don't know, thousands of years, but hundreds of years before the King Arthur story. But it was the same idea. Nobody could wield Thor's hammer except Thor. And nobody could wield Excalibur except Arthur. So what makes a great fantasy story is, I think, a really good magic weapon or a magic item, and something where it has a lot of meaning to it. You know, you don't want to just have like a magic item, and unless you're doing like sort of like a an escapist kind of story, you might just talk about magic items, elves, and whatever. Like sort of like if you read Lord of the Rings, it's an escapist story, really. It's not really a deep story of a lot of meaning. It's just a tale. It's just an adventure these little hobbits go on, and there's this evil person, and they try to overthrow him or whatever it is, and that's the, you know. But they don't really put, there's some meaning in there, because you can look at some of the things, elements in that story, and derive meaning from it, but you can't really like, it's not actually, it's more of an escapist kind of thing. If you read it, it's just like a tale of a land and people that are in that land, and you just kind of like go along with the whole journey of this hobbit. And so what's interesting about this is like, okay, so to me personally, I really get put off, like I don't, like what I think is a great fantasy story is a good, solid, like likable main character. And I think that like King Arthur was a good likable main character. Merlin, Lancelot, those guys, even Morgana, and all of the witches and all the characters from the King Arthur stories were very likable. And when it comes down to Lord of the Rings, I thought like, you know what? I really feel like with Lord of the Rings, it should have been about Gandalf being the hero. That would have been so much more interesting than the Hobbit being the hero, because like the Hobbit is like, he's just such not a strong character. And when you have a character like that who's not a strong character, it's hard to believe that they can do anything heroic. And when they do something heroic, it's not because of the power they wielded within themselves, but it was because of the magic item that they had. Like, he wasn't heroic, but the ring gave him power. It made him invisible. He was able to do things. The sword would glow when there was like danger around, so he would like know when the Rifes were attacking him, you know. And so all of this stuff would, you know, and all of the other characters also kind of protected him. You know, Frodo and Bilbo, they actually went along with a bunch of other hobbits, so they didn't go by themselves. They went with a group of hobbits to all protect each other. But they were not like into the journey. They weren't like knights. They weren't heroes. They weren't strong at all. But somehow they survived because they were surrounded by strong characters. They were surrounded by Gandalf and the elves and the dwarves and the tree people and all those guys. They were surrounded by that, and there was magic, and there was a lot of like, they received a lot of help. I mean, that's the only reason they got as far as they did. But I felt like the main character wasn't that strong. With Elric, I felt like he was a good, like, even though he got his power from magic, because naturally he was not a strong character. But he was actually like, the magic made him strong, and his sword made him completely unstoppable, because he basically had the most powerful magic item that you could possibly get in the world that he was in. No one had a stronger weapon than he did, because he had the sword. You know, he had Stormbringer, and nobody was able to confront him after that, and that was cool. And it just like, that story was good, and he wasn't just, okay, fine, he was physically a little bit weak, but he had a lot of money because he was an emperor. He had power because he was an emperor. He was also a very, very powerful magician. So maybe like physically he was weak, but magically he was very powerful, and item-wise he was very powerful, and money-wise he was powerful, and politically he was very, very powerful. You know, he had a lot of sway. He was able to ride dragons, and you know, he was basically the emperor of Melnibone, you know, of the whole land that he was emperor from. And he used the magic of the kings, that there were pacts and whatever with the kings, and they were just very, very powerful magically, from spirits or elementals or whatever it is that were in that story. You know, but he was very, very powerful. Magically, he was powerful. He had weaknesses, but magically, in other ways, he was very, very, and he was very smart, and he was just a likable character, because like, he was like more good than, he wasn't good, but he was more good than the people than he was supposed to be. Like, he wasn't supposed to be a good emperor. He was just more good than he was supposed to be, and he was more good than some of the other people, how his people were, like how his people generally were, and stuff like that. So he was just a likable character, and the way Michael Moorcock wrote him was just very, very likable, and the stories were very likable. But he was a strong character, and one of the reasons I couldn't get into Game of Thrones was because I didn't really see that there were a lot of strong characters. Really, they weren't really heroic characters. I think the most heroic character was the Mother of the Dragons. She was cool. She had powers. She had dragons. She was cool. She was like one of the strongest characters. I didn't really follow the story that much. I just couldn't get into it. But, you know, from what I know of the story, she was one of the strongest characters. because she couldn't be burned by fire. She was, the dragons would do whatever she says. She would like hatch dragon eggs and they would grow to be like full scale dragons. She was the fantasy element in that story that I felt wasn't fantasy enough. I know it became more fantasy as it went on, but in the beginning the story was not fantasy, it was medieval drama, just medieval fiction rather than medieval fantasy. And then when she came around, she was full on fantasy. She was Mother of the Dragons, that's fantasy. The elements of dragons is always cool. And I really do think also what makes a great fantasy story is not just a strong fantasy character with some kind of fantasy element, like either like a fantasy weapon, fantasy items, magical powers. It doesn't matter if they're like strong or not. Like Conan is a strong character, but he doesn't do magic at all. He's all physical, but that's cool because he's that kind of character, and he can take on a mage or a wizard, and he'll take on magic with his sword. Like he'll fight it with his sword. So he was also powerful, but he was powerful in a different way. But he was also barbaric. So I didn't follow that story too much, but he wasn't too like cultured. He was basically barbaric, And so I don't know if he read too much, or I think he did learn to read and write and all that kind of stuff, according to the story, what I understand from it. But basically he was a strong character, and you could get behind him. You're like, yeah, this is a strong character in a medieval, in a fantasy world and stuff like that. You can get behind that. So I feel like the main thing that you want to do is you want to have a story you can get behind. You want to have a character that you like, and that's like the most important thing. Like it doesn't even matter what the story is or what happens to that character and how things go. If it's a character you like, you're going to read the story. You're going to continue being with that character, and also if you like fantasy, you're probably going to like magic. So if the character it could be magic, he could be magic based, he could be just physical, non-magic based, but there's going to be magic in the story. But I feel like when the character is magic based, it's just more interesting when there's some kind of magic, some kind of magical weapons, magical spells, magical items, or gods, or like spirits, or whatever, like monsters, and of course dragons are like every fantasy story has like a dragon in it. It's just something that's really, really good. So those elements are cool. A really great quest, great monsters, great great weapons where there's a history behind the weapon, and even like sometimes that the character needs to find this weapon in order to defeat this, fulfill this quest or defeat this person, and that makes it really, really good. Of course, a great story itself, like the plot and the whole journey has to be interesting and well written, but a character that you can get behind, monsters that are cool that you can get behind, a lot of magic and explaining how that magic works in the world that you're writing about or you're telling a story about. Really good magic items, because those things are like, you after reading the story, you remember the magic items. You remember Excalibur, the sword, more than you remember any other part of the King Arthur story. You remember the sword Excalibur and how they pulled it from the stone. You remember that. And if you read the Elric stories, you remember Stormbringer, right? And if you read Game of Thrones, you remember the Mother of Dragons, because she was the most fantasy character in the whole thing. So cool, magical characters that are strong in some way, and a really cool quest, and also of course a really cool world where things are just thought out, and things are just like kind of designed, like a really cool world designed, whether that's castles in that world or forests, or the animals on the land there, or places where there's monsters or enemy warriors or different factions of people and whatever it is. A cool world and characters that you can get behind, and really, really a cool magic that you can kind of explain, and that has to do with the story and makes that character somehow relevant, whether that makes it more whether it makes the character more powerful, or the character has to fight against it, or whatever that is, in some way. All of these things, and definitely like put some fantasy elements in it. Put dragons, put elves, or create your own beasts and create your own types of people. And of course, you want castles and that classic medieval feel and stuff like that. But you want another level and another world, and it's got to be original, and it can't be like something that's already been written, you know? So this is my opinion on what I think about fantasy stories and how to create a good fantasy story and what makes a great fantasy story. And so, yeah, thanks for watching, guys. And put anything in the comments if you want, like any comments, whatever's on your mind. And yeah, and like and subscribe to the channel and like the video. And I will talk to you guys in another video later.